I want to welcome everyone. My name is Richard Sachs. I'll serve as the moderator of this town hall and press event regarding the upcoming April 7th in-person election. Along with Doug Poland, I represent 6 of the plaintiffs in the Lewis v. Knutson case. The leaders and organizations are here today for 2 reasons. First, to encourage all voters and organizations involved in getting out the vote for the upcoming election, take advantage of the partial victory which we secured yesterday when Judge Conley ordered that absentee ballots may be turned in until 4 p.m. on April 13th. And that absentee voters may cast their ballots without the witness requirement. They simply provide a statement that they were unable to safely obtain a written certification despite reasonable efforts to do so. The second is that across the state of Wisconsin, we're careening towards a dysfunctional in-person election on April 7th, in which scores of voting wards will be consolidated into single sites. Voters will not be informed about where they're supposed to go vote. And many jurisdictions, at this point, over 110, don't even have poll workers to open the polling sites. Green Bay is going to only have 2 polling sites for the entire city. Milwaukee, we were just informed just moments ago, will only have 5 or 6 polling sites for 327 wards. That's over 70 wards crammed into each polling site. An unprecedented occurrence in an election. If held as currently scheduled on April 7th, this in-person election will force hundreds of thousands of voters across the state to choose between staying home and being disenfranchised, or risking exposure to COVID-19 in consolidated, crowded polling places in which thousands of voters and poll workers will congregate in close proximity. At this juncture, all 3 branches of government have failed to act to protect the public health of our voters, our poll workers, and the public. Our speakers who are here today have all been involved in this election in one capacity or another, in helping get out the vote, in helping educate voters about how to navigate the current crisis we face, be casting their ballots, or in terms of protecting the public health. And we're here today to call upon our governor and the legislative leaders to act now to postpone the in-person election on Tuesday to protect our health and our right to vote. Our first speaker will be Reverend Greg Lewis, who's the president of Souls to the Polls, an organization that has been in the forefront in mobilizing parishioners to go to vote on the north side of Milwaukee. Reverend Lewis is just returning from the hospital and has been recuperating and convalescing from COVID-19. And as we told him earlier, it's hard to keep a champion on the ground, and Reverend Lewis is here today to help provide his thoughts on why the election should be postponed. Reverend?
Thank you. Yeah, I've spent the last several days just fighting for my life. I guess you could say I'm one of the blessed ones because I survived. Unlike a growing number of men and women in our community who have succumbed to this virus. This is a killer virus. And people just don't understand the magnitude and the possibilities of folks putting themselves at risk this way. I made it to the hospital and I was in the ICU and I was laying on my back, and the thing the doctor said to me is, if you don't do exactly what we say, you're going to die. And they asked me if I wanted to be revived, if I lost consciousness. And he said, well, I just have to ask you because we won't be able to revive you. And then he said, well, you need to write down who's going to take care of your last rites and all those things. And I'm not being mean, I'm just telling you that the situation is very, very grave. What you have is very, very serious. See, this is what we're asked to make a choice about. The state of Wisconsin and its elected officials, they just don't get it. It is shocking and wrong to hold an election that could result in spreading this killer virus and killing more people. Souls to the Polls has gotten calls from people who always work the polls, citizens who are dedicated to our democracy and value their right to vote. They are afraid to work the polls. They won't work because of this killer virus. We support those poll workers. People in my community value the vote. My ancestors and folks, they fought and died for the right to vote. You're asking us to fight and die for our lives to vote again. Folks were beaten for it, and many people died so that we can have this opportunity. By refusing to delay this election, you are again threatening their very lives, making them choose between exercising their rights as citizens and living and taking care of loved ones.
Thank you, Reverend.
Simply immoral not to postpone this election. And let me repeat going forward, that means disenfranchising whole communities. Poll workers are refusing to work the polls. Voters are scared to vote. What is the governor waiting for? What is the legislator waiting for? It is time to stop playing games with people's lives. It is time to stop playing games with our rights. It is time to postpone the election before more people die because elected leaders irresponsibly fail to act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend. Our next speaker is Heather Dubois-Bornay, who for nearly a decade has been a chief inspector at the polls in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. She's also the executive director of the Wisconsin Public Education Network. And Heather has been outspoken and about the dilemma, the conundrum facing poll workers in terms of their commitment to democracy versus their commitment to public health, and has tried to balance that issue and is here to talk about the decisions she's made. Heather?
Thank you. Yeah, I agonized for weeks over the decision of whether to work the election next Tuesday, weighing my own risk against the risk of coworkers at the polls, most of whom are elderly and many of whom had already announced that they weren't going to be working the polls, knowing that our community already faced a shortage of poll workers going into this election because we had recently increased our number of polling places, and knowing that just statewide there was going to be a lot of tension and anxiety in this election, and the need for cool-headed leadership at the polls as people came in concerned and scared and worried about their own health and public safety. So the decision that I made to not work next week is not one that I made lightly, but after seeing the Wisconsin Election Commission's report from earlier this week, that over 7,000 poll workers had been confirmed to have already announced that they weren't going to work the polls, it's made it crystal clear to me that we cannot guarantee the integrity of this election. There is no way that we can expect our clerks to be able to pull this off and meet the letter of the law and conduct the election safely. When I read Judge Conley's scathing indictment of the legislature's decision not to move the election back, and basically his statement that these election results will be challenged and they will see their challenge after the fact. I thought, how can I be complicit in this moral failure? I just can't be a part of it. And I was also getting pressure, I can add, from my own family, who was worried about my health, worried about me potentially being a carrier and exposing more people at the polls and possibly bringing it back into our home. We are putting our poll workers in an impossible dilemma here and asking them to choose between defending democracy or protecting the public good. Those things are not mutually exclusive. Those of us who choose to do election work do so because we're committed to democracy, committed to fair and open elections, committed to civic engagement, and above all, committed to our communities and giving voters, every single eligible voter in our communities, the right and the opportunity to vote. I can't meet that commitment by working this election, and I can't participate in it for those reasons. So it's my deep commitment to democracy that has ultimately driven my decision not to work. And I call on all of our lawmakers right now to put the politics aside and do the right thing. The fact that we're even debating this right now is deeply shameful. And I am grateful that there are so many people around the state raising their collective voices right now. I hope it does not fall on deaf ears. It's certainly not too late to do the right thing.
Thank you, Heather. Our next speaker is Christine Newman-Ortiz, the Executive Director of Voces de la Frontera. And Voces de la Frontera has a very vigorous voter education, voter mobilization campaign, including thousands of volunteers in its Voceros program, attempting to get out the vote. And Christine will talk about the problems that Get Out the Vote campaign faces in terms of mobilizing people for an in-person election on April 7th. Christine.
In Wisconsin, we are witnessing a staggering failure of leadership on the part of Republican leadership, of the executive office, and of the courts to ensure the safety of Wisconsinites on election day, and obviously a historic level of disenfranchisement that is taking place. As an organization that works with the Latino community, primarily working class families, also many Latino seniors, we know that we're already leaving out so many people. We can say, okay, one more day till 5 p.m. today, one more day online, ask for that ballot. Well, that assumes that you're already registered. Many Latinos, for example, really do count on same-day registration because they move or they vote infrequently or they're first-time voters. So for them, many people are going to not vote on April 7th. So, forget that. And for folks who are being told vote online, again, that assumes that people have access to the technology, the knowledge. Many people don't. And we're already seeing that come in with some of the reports that have come out that say that like 1,000 people submitted their request for an absentee ballot by, taking a selfie instead of taking a photo of the driver's license. Well, let's throw those votes out too. There's the talk about the National Guard being brought in. The National Guard is not an answer to what will continue to be a health risk, as well as that, for example, in the Latino community, but not just the Latino community, you have language needs. How are we going to guarantee that we have bilingual poll workers available? Right now, the bilingual ballots are only going to be available in 3 cities, Milwaukee, Madison, and Arcadia. And there's a lot of nuances that go with being a poll worker. You don't just throw someone into that position. And just the fact that there's been this consolidation. A lot of people who do vote regularly know where it is and are going to go there assuming that they can vote there. And so it's going to create a tremendous amount of confusion about where they should go. And because people have been sharing kind of personally some of their experiences in relationship to this election, I just want to say, like, my father's receiving treatment for cancer, and he's, of a generation that's how he participates. He values his vote. It's how he has a voice in government. And he did early voting, and it made me angry to think, why is he having to make that choice? He shouldn't have to make that choice. There should be options available that he feels comfortable with. Or we should have an election that is postponed where he can vote and he's not having to put his health in jeopardy. And people will do that. Some people will do that. And that's unconscionable. Unconscionable that we have an emergency order, but it doesn't matter when it comes time to elections. This is partisan politics. This is politics over people on both sides. And that's why we're calling on Wisconsinites to step up, to really demand that our leaders postpone this election so that we can have a safe election and we can follow the guidelines for the benefit of all at a time when Wisconsin is actually peaking with the coronavirus.
Thank you, Christine. Our next speaker is Dana Schultz, who's the Executive Director of Wisconsin Voices, an organization committed to voter registration, voter mobilization, and voter education, and works with scores of organizations around the state, and recently submitted a letter to our state's leaders. Dana?
Thank you, everyone, and Reverend Lewis, I'm glad you're feeling better, but I'll get right to the point. We believe, and I'm saying we, Wisconsin Voices, a network of over 60 nonprofits who work tirelessly to make sure every person is counted and heard in our democracy. A democracy that was set up with lots of barriers and restrictions in the first place. And unfortunately, the leadership in Wisconsin right now, specifically Representative Voss and Speaker Fitzgerald, and continuing to perpetuate the barriers to vote that specifically have disenfranchised and hurt Black people and Latinx people and poor rural people. And that's what we are seeing happen at a magnitude that is immoral, it's dangerous, and it's racist. And so you can read our letter on our website. It's signed by over 16 of our organizations. We have recommendations, common sense solutions that would benefit Wisconsinites being able to actually fulfill the promise of democracy that our state and our country has given. That would include Black and brown and white and Indigenous people being able to be heard. There are solutions out there, but what it's going to take is bold and decisive leadership and realizing this is not a time to do status quo, that we are asking people to risk their lives to vote. But what we're asking is that politicians risk upsetting the status quo, that they risk taking on a decision that might be challenged in the courts, because this all will be. We are urging them to risk some of their political capital in this time. That's the least they can do, and we're asking people to risk their lives. Now is not the time to submit to political fears, and that's what I believe what we've seen. It's fear on top of fear and lack of decisions. So on a practical level, what we're getting is mass confusion. Let me give you an example. Our organization sent out 70,000 text messages to people who were unlikely to have registered to vote, saying your last day to register was X. Then we got a new hearing saying we have another week. We sent out another 70,000 messages. Now we get one more day of absentee ballot requests. It's the massive amount of piecemeal information with a lack of coordinated leadership and a campaign to say, hey, this is the work it's going to take to ensure every human and every person can be heard in this election and will not have to risk their health to do it. That is the leadership we are asking for. It's pretty simple. And we're calling upon Senator Fitzgerald, Speaker Voss, Governor Evers to stand up in this moment and to put some of their own political capital on the line and to risk their own political capital in this time and not asking their constituents to risk their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Janelle Heinrich is here. She's the Director of Public Health, Madison and Dane County. She's responsible for ensuring the health and well-being of Dane County residents. And she's the director of that organization, which has been outspoken about the importance of trying to preserve the public health during this election. Janelle?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here to talk about this. So at Public Health Madison Dane County, as you said, we are very committed to the well-being of all of our residents, and we rely on data and best practice to make those recommendations. And the data and information that we're looking at and what we know to be true around how to not spread illness is that we are very concerned that holding an in-person election could make the spread of COVID-19 worse. Our job is to draw attention to the ways that systems and policies may impact health. And it's clear that holding the elections on April 7th, we feel would have a very significant impact on people's individual health and a ripple effect on our larger community and our public health and our healthcare systems. And we want to make sure that we want to speak loudly about that because we want to preserve those institutions and those people's well-being. So, and I feel very strongly that holding an in-person election is in direct conflict with the critical steps that we have already taken through our safer at home orders. In the absence of a vaccine or a cure, our public health tools to combat this epidemic are few. Keeping people at home where they are unable to spread virus to each other is our best tool to keep people safe and healthy. We have seen so far in Madison and Dane County that physical distancing orders have made a difference. Our public health nurses interview people every day who test positive, and we have seen that over time, especially since those orders have been in place, we are seeing people with COVID-19 have fewer contacts outside of their home, which means that they aren't spreading illness throughout the community. And the reality is that an in-person election has the potential to reverse this progress and is a risk we should just not willingly take. I feel strongly we've been a leader in Wisconsin and in Dane County at enacting public health interventions throughout this epidemic. And if this election goes forward, Wisconsin would be an outlier if it hosted in-person elections on April 7th, given what we've seen. It would be 24 days after we have reached 20 confirmed cases of COVID-19 and out of alignment with what we're seeing nationally with regard to election practices being implemented across the country. I know that there's inherent logistical and systemic challenges to that, but it's important that we use this as an opportunity to postpone or go to mail-in to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 that we know is happening. People should not feel like they have to make the choice between obeying their public health orders or public health advice to stay at home and going to the polls on April 7th. We believe that mailing ballots to every Wisconsin resident and extending the deadline is the urgent step to take now to prevent the spread of illness. And it's a preservation and implementation of public health best practice to support the preservation of our civic engagement. We believe that everyone should be able to participate in the process of democratic decision making because voting outcomes shape the decisions that are made in communities, and those decisions impact so many of our aspects of our lives and our opportunities to be healthy. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you.
Deborah Cronmiller is the Executive Director of the Wisconsin League of Women Voters. She's been in the forefront and outspoken from the beginning about the impact of this pandemic on the right to vote for all of Wisconsin citizens, and has also been a party to the lawsuits challenging the conducting of this election under these circumstances. Deborah.
Thank you, Rich. The League of Women Voters of Wisconsin is a 100-year-old, nonpartisan, pro-democracy advocacy organization. We've worked throughout our history to ensure that all voters are informed, able to access the polls, and dedicated to participating in the democratic process. Wisconsin voters should not have to choose between their voting rights and their health. Our members should not be torn about the messages we send to the electorate, And yet, in this time of pandemic, we are. Postponing in-person voting will allow Wisconsin to address the new need to have voters use absentee ballots to make their voice heard. This process is new and unfamiliar to many voters, as we have heard, and more time is needed if Wisconsin is going to make it possible for everyone to vote in the spring election and presidential primary. Going ahead with the April 7th in-person election is dangerous and will disenfranchise too many voters. By keeping the polls open next week, the state is asking people to risk their lives and the lives of others in order to exercise their right to vote. No democracy should ever force people to make this choice. There are common sense solutions that will benefit every Wisconsinite. We should all want the election postponed, at least until Executive Order number 12 is lifted. We should all want more opportunity for voters to request and return absentee ballots, for less cumbersome witness and ID requirements, and for more public education to inform the people of Wisconsin what they need to do to vote. We urge our governor and the legislature to do the right thing. Don't ask poll workers, the National Guard, and voters to risk their lives. Postpone this election. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. That concludes our speakers. If there's any questions from members of the press or anyone else, we'll entertain those.
And we'll need to know if you're on the call. So if somebody can just email me. This is Max. If you can email me and let me know you're on the call, I can let you ask a question. We do have one question in the chat.
Question from Todd Richmond is whether the Lewis plaintiffs are appealing to the Seventh Circuit. We are not appealing that portion of the denial of our request. However, we are defending against the Republican Party's appeal of Judge Connolly's order. The Republicans are appealing that principally because they want fewer voters to be able to have the opportunity to cast their ballots on election day. That's the bottom line, and that's the only basis of that appeal, is that they want fewer people to have the opportunity to cast their ballot. And we intend to try to preserve that partial victory, which was provided for in Judge Connolly's order, and we're very confident that we will be able to do so.
I'm enabling some members of the press that I recognize on the list to speak. So if anybody wants to ask a question, you're all still muted except for somebody on the 202 line. I'm just going to mute you just in case. If you need to ask a question, you can unmute and do so, or ask in the chat.
I see there's a question, why not appeal to force postponement? We feel at this juncture the best way to try to get the election postponed is to try to place pressure, as Judge Connolly indicated, place pressure on our elected leadership, on the governor, on the leaders of the legislature, to come to their senses and realize that the only sensible thing to do to avoid the looming election day catastrophe is to postpone the April 7th election and reschedule it for another date. There's a question, when is a ruling expected on the appeal? We don't know. The attorneys on the plaintiff's side, all of them, we've all filed notices to defend against the appeal, and we have not received any indication from the Seventh Circuit at this point as to any briefing schedule on the issues and when they may or may not issue a decision. Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for participating, and participants and speakers as well. And we'll conclude this virtual town hall session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.